So one of the main questions that I get about the Idaho case is the unidentified male DNA that's been spoken about predominantly. So a lot of conspiracy channels have spoken about the fact that because there's unidentified male DNA found inside or outside of that home, as we are unaware as to where that DNA is actually found yet, they look at this as if the unidentified male DNA that's been spoken about in the Idaho case means that there's other individuals involved. But I will break every single part of this down. So to break this down simplistically, what it actually means is this a full profile of DNA? Now, the unidentified male DNA could be bryankohberger's DNA. What I'm trying to explain here is that there wasn't enough of a full profile of DNA for them to be able to upload it to get anything out of it. So this DNA in itself could be bryankohberger's, but because it's partial DNA, it isn't enough of a match to be able to match it to the individual in question. Another way of looking at this unidentified male DNA is as simplistically as this. Is it possible that there's other male DNA in a house of university students in which the occupants are all female? And the easy answer to that one is, well, yes. But when it comes down to touch DNA and could somebody else have planted this sheath there, we'll also get into that one as well. The simplistic answer to that question is the fact that they were able to upload this and get a match through genealogy. That means that they have a full profile of DNA in order to be able to upload it to match it to the individual's family tree. But I'm going to break all this down and literally just get into this straight away. So they probably have enough to show that the DNA in itself is that of a male, but nothing else. Just because they haven't ruled Bryankohberger in, it doesn't mean that they haven't ruled Bryankohberger out. Now, the repeat sequence will be the same in every cell within a person. Thus, the DNA profile from a blood sample will be the same as from a plucked hair, inside of a tooth, saliva, or skin. But this also means that a DNA profile will not in itself indicate from what tissue it originated. So here we need to consider the knife sheath integral to this investigation. The question to this might be, who owned or who held that knife sheath? Now, a swab that's cotton or nylon will be moistened and rubbed all over the handle to collect any cells that are present. That swab will then be placed inside of a tube containing a cocktail of chemicals that purifies the DNA from the rest of the cellular material. And this is a highly automated process, and the amount of DNA will then be quantified. And if there is sufficient DNA present, they can then proceed to generate a DNA profile. And this is where people need to really pay attention here. The optimum amount of DNA needed to generate the profile is 500 picograms. Now this is really tiny and only represents 80 cells. So then how foolproof is DNA profiling? DNA profiling in itself is highly sensitive, given the fact that it can work from just 80 cells, and this is microscopic. And the tiniest pinprick of blood holds thousands of blood cells. So consider this knife sheath, and consider that this knife sheath has been handled by two people, perhaps including a legitimate owner or a person of interest. Yet there are only 80 cells found present on that knife sheath. Those 80 cells would not be from only one person but two. Hence, there is now a less than optimal amount of DNA from either of the people, and the DNA profiling will be a mixture of the two. Now, fortunately, there are several types of software to pull apart these mixed DNA profiles. However, the DNA profile might be incomplete, and the term for this is partial. So, with less DNA data, there will be a reduced power to identify the person. And worse still, there may be insufficient DNA to generate any meaningful DNA profile from at all. And if the sensitivity of the testing is then pushed further, they then might obtain a DNA profile from even fewer cells. But this can implicate that a person who may have held that knife sheath innocently weeks prior to an alleged event, or be with someone who shook hands with another person who then held the knife sheath. And this later event is then called an indirect transfer. And this is something to consider with small amounts of DNA. But the DNA on the knife sheath clearly wasn't that of a small profile, because they were able to upload this to genealogy and able to obtain a match to his family tree. Now, no lab technician is going to say specifically that it's him or that it's his family. What they will do is come forward and testify by giving odds. So it's more odds and probability on the individual in question. And in the case of the IDAHO4, the match that they got was a 1 in 5.37 octillion match, which for anyone unaware is 1 followed by 26 zeros, meaning you could run the entire world's database of DNA through this, and they're saying that you're only going conclusively to one family. So in the odds that they've basically given us, what we can take from that is what they're actually saying is this is pretty much 100% his family. But we'll get into that right now. So in forensics, using DNA means comparing a profile from a sample to a reference profile. So such as taken from a witness, a person of interest, or even criminal databases. By itself, a DNA profile is a set of numbers, and the only thing that we can figure out is whether the owner of the DNA has a Y chromosome. That is, that their biological sex is male. A standard STR DNA profile does not indicate anything about a person's appearance, predisposition to any diseases, and gives very little about their ancestry. Other types of DNA testing, such as ones used in genealogy, can be used to associate the DNA at a crime scene to a potential genetic relative of the person's. But current standard STR DNA profiling will not link to anyone other than perhaps very close relatives. Parents, offsprings, and siblings. Now, when it comes to the IDAHO4 case, people claim that the DNA found on the knife sheath was touch DNA. So if you go to page 3 of the PCA that was released about Bryankohberger and what they believe happened, I'll just read it right here. The Idaho State Lab later located a single source of male DNA. Suspect profile left on the button snap of the knife sheath. They didn't locate touch DNA on the knife sheath. They located a singular source of DNA, whereas the other DNA that they found in the house could be Bryankohberger's, could also not be Bryankohberger's, but it wasn't enough of a genetic structure for them to be able to match or link it to anything conclusively. Therefore, it just isn't used because there's not enough of a genetic structure for them to be able to do anything with it. But in this case, they had singular source, and they were able to upload that to genealogy, and through that they were able to make a connection to Bryankohberger's family, meaning that if this was touch DNA, they would have been able to have separated this and somewhat figured it out earlier on. The DNA in itself is conclusively to that of one individual, and as much as this individual's alibi says that he was at Hawaii County Park, DNA scientifically points to him being at the scene of the crime. DNA profiling has been, and will continue to be, an incredibly powerful forensic test to answer whose biological material is this, and this is its tremendous strength. As to how and when that material got there, well, that's just an issue for Bryankohberger to sort out. Well, that's it from me. If there's anyone that you know that's confused about the unidentified male DNA, posting onto other people's TikToks that it must be some kind of huge conspiracy, there is your fucking answer.